in January of the year 1072. Two brothers from Normandy stood before the gates of a city that travellers of that age described as one of the largest in the world, a place they compared to the great capitals of the East and reckoned greater than anything in the Latin West, possibly greater than Rome itself. It was a Muslim city, full of mosques and gardens and markets selling silk and lemons, and it had already survived a long succession of empires, every one of which had believed it would possess the city forever. The brothers took it, and then Palermo did to them what it had done to everyone who came before. It swallowed them. Phoenicians founded it. Greeks and Carthaginians bled over it. Romans taxed it. Arabs perfected it. Normans crowned themselves kings in it. Spain governed it by mail for centuries. And in the 20th century, its own children nearly destroyed it, until two judges and a city that had finally had enough fought back. This is the story of one of the most frequently conquered cities in the Mediterranean. Every empire wanted Palermo. None of them could keep it. The question is why, and the answer explains almost everything about Sicily, including the one thing you already think you know about it. Our story opens on the water, 28 centuries ago. Chapter 1. The Harbour Before the Name. Somewhere beneath the streets of modern Palermo lies a woman who was buried with a mirror from Egypt. We do not know her name. She was laid in the ground on the southern edge of the ancient city more than 2,000 years ago, in one of the largest Phoenician and Punic burial grounds ever found. A vast field of tombs uncovered by archaeologists under the buildings of the modern town. Around her, and around the hundreds of others buried there, excavators found the ordinary luxuries of their lives: pottery from Greece, ornaments and amulets in the Egyptian style, glass, jewellery, and small carved objects that had travelled hundreds of miles before ending up in the hands of a family on a bay in northwestern Sicily. These were not conquerors or kings. They were merchants and sailors and their wives and children, and even in death they were surrounded by imports. That is the first true portrait we have of the people of this city, and it tells you everything about why they were here. Because every city on earth exists for a reason. Some exist because of a river crossing, some because of a defensible hill, some because a king pointed at a map. Palermo exists because of a shape. Look at the northwestern coast of Sicily and you will see it. A wide, curved bay, sheltered from the open sea, backed by a ring of mountains that catch the rain and feed the streams. The bay faces north, away from the storms that sweep the southern coast. Two small rivers once ran down through the plain and met the sea here, carving out a natural inner harbour where a ship could sit as calmly as a toy in a bathtub. Sailors in the ancient Mediterranean did not have weather forecasts. They did not have lighthouses or coast guards. What they had were places like this, a harbour that forgave your mistakes. The people who understood this first were the Phoenicians. They came from the coast of what is now Lebanon, from cities like Tyre and Sidon, and they were not conquerors in the way we usually imagine conquerors. They were merchants. Their empire, if you can call it that, was a chain of harbours stretching across the entire Mediterranean, each one placed with the cold precision of a business decision. They were asking one question: where can a ship rest, restock, and trade on the long run between the eastern Mediterranean and the metal markets of Spain? Sometime in the 8th century before Christ, in the same great age of expansion that tradition dates to the 730s before Christ, they chose this bay. The settlement they planted here was, by the best archaeological estimate, a modest one, a trading post on a tongue of land between the two rivers, close to the water. easy to defend, easier to leave. The name they gave it is usually recorded as Ziz, which is often translated as flower, though scholars still debate the exact meaning. The name that stuck came later, from the Greeks, who looked at that generous bay and called the place Panormos, which means something like all harbour, a place that is entirely a port. That name is the most honest thing anyone has ever said about this city. Palermo was not founded as a fortress. It was not founded as a holy site or a royal capital. It was founded as a way station, a place designed from its first day to receive strangers, take their goods, sell them what they needed, and send them on. That is the city's character, and it never changed. 3,000 years later, the markets of Palermo still work on that exact logic, and we will walk through one of them before this story ends. If you are watching this in the United States, you already know this kind of city. It is the logic of New Orleans, of San Francisco, of every port town whose founders cared less about who you were and more about what you were carrying. Port cities have a personality. They are open, adaptable, a little cynical, and very hard to kill. Palermo is one of the oldest members of that family still in business. Now, the part of the story that most tellings get wrong, or at least tell too simply. We often imagine the ancient Mediterranean as a Greek lake, a world of temples and philosophers. But Sicily in the 8th and 7th centuries before Christ was a divided island, and the division ran straight through its middle. The Greeks were arriving too, in the same generation as the Phoenicians, planting their own colonies on the eastern and southern coasts. Syracuse, founded by Corinthian settlers in that same era, would grow into one of the largest Greek cities in the world. The island filled up from both ends. Greeks in the east, Phoenicians in the west, with the native Sicilian peoples, the Sicani and the Elymians and the Sicels, living between and among them, and Palermo sat on the Phoenician side of that line. This single fact shaped its next 500 years. Because the Phoenician settlements of western Sicily did not remain independent trading posts forever, over time they came under the protection, and then the control, of the greatest Phoenician city of all, a former colony on the North African coast that had grown into a superpower. Carthage, from roughly the 6th century before Christ onward, Palermo was, in practice, a Carthaginian city. Its harbour sheltered Carthaginian fleets. Its walls, which grew thicker with each generation, faced east, toward the Greeks. Consider what that means for the identity of this place. The city that would one day hold the most celebrated royal court in Christian Europe began its life as an outpost of an African empire, facing its neighbours across a fault line between civilizations. Palermo has rarely sat comfortably inside any European mainstream. It has usually been the frontier, the meeting point, the place where the map changes colour. There is one more thing the Phoenicians gave this city, and it is bigger than walls or tombs. They gave it a habit, the habit of surviving under someone else's flag. From its very first century, Palermo answered to a mother city far across the sea, first Tyre in spirit, then Carthage in fact. It learned early how to be governed from a distance, how to profit from an empire without loving it, how to keep its markets running no matter whose warships filled the bay. Every city learns something in childhood that it never forgets. Athens learned pride. Rome learned discipline. Palermo learned adaptation. That habit was about to be tested, because the two halves of Sicily could not ignore each other forever. To the east, the Greek cities were growing rich, ambitious, and heavily armed. To the south, Carthage viewed western Sicily as its shield. Between them lay some of the most fertile land in the Mediterranean, and two peoples who both believed the island should belong to them. Somewhere under the modern city, the woman with the Egyptian mirror lay in the ground, surrounded by the goods of a world at peace with itself. 300 years of war were about to begin above her head. Chapter 2. The Wars That Never Ended. There is a certain kind of geography that guarantees war. A rich island, sitting in the exact center of a sea, within sight of two continents, claimed by two civilizations at once. Sicily in the 5th century before Christ was that geography, and for the next 300 years it became the battlefield where the ancient world's great powers tested each other, generation after generation, in a conflict so long that no one alive at its end could remember its beginning. If you want a modern comparison, think of the buffer states of our own era, the countries caught between great powers, invaded and divided and fought over precisely because of where they sit on the map. Sicily was the ancient world's version of that, and Palermo, the finest harbour on the island's western coast, was one of the prizes everyone counted. The pattern announced itself with a single spectacular collision. In the year 480 before Christ, a massive Carthaginian force landed in Sicily and marched on the Greek city of Himera, on the northern coast, not far east of Palermo. Picture the scene the ancient historians describe: a sprawling invasion camp by the sea, ships drawn up on the beach, and inside the walls a Greek city waiting for the allied armies of Syracuse and Acragas to arrive. When the battle came, it was a catastrophe for Carthage. The Greek accounts say the Carthaginian commander Hamilcar died in the disaster, and one tradition holds that he threw himself into a sacrificial fire as his army collapsed around him. Those same accounts claim the battle fell on the very day the Greeks defeated Persia at Salamis, on the other side of the Mediterranean. That timing is almost certainly too perfect to be true, and historians have long suspected the date was arranged for dramatic effect. But the outcome was real. Carthage pulled back, licked its wounds for 70 years, and then returned with a vengeance that burned Greek cities off the map, including Himera itself, destroyed so completely that its people were killed or scattered, and the site never truly recovered. For Palermo, these wars followed a rhythm that must have felt like weather. Armies came east, armies came west, and the city held its walls, sheltered the fleets of Carthage, and endured. Greek commanders attacked it more than once. The great Syracusan leaders who tried to drive Carthage from Sicily entirely, and there were several across the centuries, all understood that western Sicily could not be held while Palermo's harbour stayed open to African ships. The city was besieged, blockaded, and assaulted, and it remained, stubbornly, Carthaginian. The most famous Greek ever to take it was Pyrrhus of Epirus, the brilliant and restless king whose costly victories gave us the phrase Pyrrhic victory. In the year 276 before Christ, he stormed through western Sicily and captured Palermo, achieving what generations of Greek commanders before him had failed to do. It was the high point of his Sicilian campaign, and it lasted barely 2 years. Pyrrhus alienated his Greek allies, abandoned the island, and sailed home, reportedly remarking as he left that he was leaving behind a wrestling ground for Carthage and Rome. Whether he actually said those words, we cannot know. Ancient writers loved to put prophecies in the mouths of departing kings, but if he did say it, he was exactly right, because the third power had finally arrived. Rome in the 3rd century before Christ was not yet an empire. It was a republic of farmers and soldiers that had just finished unifying the Italian peninsula. and it had no navy worth mentioning. Carthage was the greatest naval power in the western Mediterranean, with centuries of seafaring behind it. When the two collided over Sicily in the year 264 before Christ, beginning what we call the First Punic War, most sensible observers would have bet on Carthage. What happened instead is one of the most astonishing stories in military history. Rome decided to become a naval power from nothing. According to the ancient sources, the Romans copied the design of a captured Carthaginian warship, built fleets of their own, lost them in battles and storms, and simply built more. The war ground on for 23 years, most of it in and around Sicily, and it consumed men and ships on a scale the Mediterranean had never seen. Palermo's turn came in the year 254 before Christ. A Roman fleet and army attacked the city, broke through into the outer districts, and forced its surrender. After roughly 5 centuries under Phoenician and Carthaginian rule, Palermo changed civilizations for the first time. Carthage wanted it back. 4 years later, one of the decisive battles of the entire war was fought directly beneath the city's walls. A Carthaginian army advanced on Palermo with a weapon designed to terrify. A corps of war elephants, possibly more than 100 of them, though ancient numbers are always to be treated with caution. The Roman commander, Lucius Caecilius Metellus, refused to meet them in the open plain. He kept his men behind the city's defences, harassed the elephants with javelins and arrows from the walls and trenches, and waited. The wounded animals panicked. They turned and stampeded back through their own army, and Metellus struck at exactly that moment. The Carthaginian force collapsed. The captured elephants were shipped to Rome and paraded before the public, and the Metellus family put an elephant on its coins for generations afterward, a permanent advertisement of what their ancestor had done at Palermo. One detail of that battle deserves a moment. It was won by patience, by walls, and by letting the enemy's own strength destroy him. The city did not win it. The city was the stage, but no battle in Palermo's history better predicted its future. Time and again, over the next 2,000 years, the powers that held this city would learn that its greatest weapon was never force. It was the ability to wait, absorb, and let the conqueror defeat himself. The war ended in the year 241 before Christ, with a final naval battle off western Sicily. Carthage gave up the island entirely, and Sicily became something new, something with enormous consequences for our story. It became Rome's first overseas province, the first piece of territory Rome ever ruled that was not part of Italy, the laboratory where Rome learned how to be an empire. The lesson Palermo learned was colder. For 300 years, Greeks and Carthaginians had bled over Sicily, and the prize went to a third party that neither of them had feared. When empires fight over you, the winner is never you. Chapter 3. 600 Quiet Years. Ask most history books what happened in Palermo under Roman rule, and you will get a shrug. 6 centuries pass in a paragraph. No revolution, no royal courts, no burning skyline. And it is true that Roman Palermo was a modest place, a provincial harbour town with baths and temples and a theatre, comfortable and unimportant. But I want to make an argument in this chapter, and it is the kind of argument that only becomes visible when you look at a very long stretch of time. The quietest era in Sicily's history built a pattern that Sicily's future kept rebuilding. Let me say this precisely, because precision matters here. Rome did not create the mafia. Nothing that happened 2,000 years ago made anything inevitable. But Roman Sicily established an arrangement of land and power that the island would see again and again under different flags. And when we reach the 19th century, the failure to finally break that arrangement will matter enormously. Watch how the machine is built. You will recognize it when it returns. Start with what Sicily was for, what Rome wanted from Sicily. Above everything else was grain. The island's soils and broad inland valleys made it one of the great breadbaskets of the ancient world. And Cicero, in a phrase repeated ever since, called Sicily the Republic's granary, the nurse that fed the Roman people. Feeding Rome was the province's job, and everything about how the island was organized flowed from that purpose. And the organization worked like this. The land was gathered, over time, into enormous estates. The Romans called them latifundia, vast tracts of wheat country owned by rich men who, very often, did not live anywhere near them. The owners lived in Rome or in the coastal cities. The land was run by managers and overseers, and it was worked, in the late Republic especially, by masses of enslaved people, prisoners from Rome's wars shipped to Sicily in chains. Slot the pieces into place and look at the machine. Absentee owners, middlemen with enormous local power and no oversight. A workforce with no rights. Wealth flowing permanently away from the island toward a distant capital. And a government far across the water that cared about the grain shipments arriving on time and asked very few questions about how Sicily would see that machine again, rebuilt with different names, under later rulers, and its ghost was still shaping the countryside around Palermo when the modern era arrived. Historians genuinely disagree about how much continuity is real across those centuries and how much is coincidence, and we will honor that debate when we reach it. But the pattern itself, land held by the absent, managed by the unaccountable, worked by the powerless, is documented in era after era. The Roman machine broke down in spectacular fashion at least twice. In the 2nd century before Christ, Sicily exploded in two of the largest slave revolts in ancient history, with rebel armies numbering in the tens of thousands according to the ancient accounts, holding inland cities for years before Rome crushed them. The revolts mostly burned through the island's interior rather than Palermo itself, but they tell you what the quiet province actually felt like from below. And then there is the man whose name became a synonym for corrupt government. In the 70s before Christ, Sicily was governed by Gaius Verus, a Roman official who treated the province as his personal treasury, extorting landowners, stealing artworks, and selling justice. The Sicilians did something remarkable. They hired a young, ambitious lawyer named Marcus Tullius Cicero to prosecute him. Cicero built his case with such devastating thoroughness that Verres fled into exile before the trial even finished, and the published speeches, the Verrine orations, survive to this day as one of our best windows into how a Roman province was actually run and robbed. Note who won that round. For once, the island's patience and paperwork beat the powerful man. It would not happen often. Rome also gave Sicily one strange detour worth 30 seconds. During Rome's civil wars, in the years after Julius Caesar's assassination, Sicily became the naval fortress of Sextus Pompeius, son of Pompey the Great, who used the island to blockade Rome's grain supply and defied the future Emperor Augustus for years. The war ended with Sicily punished, some of its cities stripped and taxed, and the island pushed even further into the background of the empire. Palermo carried on as it always had, a harbour doing business. When the Western Empire finally came apart in the 5th century after Christ, Sicily was passed around like furniture in an estate sale. The Vandals, ruling from the old Carthaginian territory in North Africa, raided and claimed it. History does have a sense of irony. 700 years after Rome took Palermo from Africa, Africa took it back. Then the Ostrogoths, the Germanic kingdom ruling Italy, held it. Then, in the 530s, the Eastern Roman Empire, which we call Byzantium, sent its greatest general, Belisarius, to reconquer the West, and Sicily fell to him almost without a fight. Byzantine Sicily lasted 3 centuries, and it left deeper marks than the textbooks usually admit. Greek returned as the language of administration and worship. The island's churches looked east, toward Constantinople, and for one strange 5-year stretch in the 660s, the Emperor Constans II actually moved his court to Sicily, ruling what remained of the Roman Empire from the island, until he was assassinated at Syracuse. According to the traditional account, he was struck down in his bath with a metal vessel by one of his own attendants. The empire's centre of gravity snapped back east, and Sicily returned to its familiar role, a valuable possession on somebody else's frontier. 600 years of this had produced a particular kind of place, a city and an island with no political centre of their own, accustomed to distant rulers, skilled at absorbing whoever arrived, holding quietly onto their own ways underneath the official surface. Palermo had been Carthaginian, Roman, Vandal, Gothic, and Byzantine, and underneath all of it, it had simply remained itself, a port town on a perfect bay, waiting. In the year 827, the waiting ended. Sails appeared on the southern horizon, and they were flying no flag that Sicily had ever seen before. Chapter 4. The City of 300 Mosques. The fleet that crossed the narrow water from North Africa that year carried an army of Arabs and Berbers under the banner of the Aghlabid dynasty of Tunisia. The pretext was an invitation from a rebellious Byzantine commander named Euphemius, who had lost a power struggle and wanted allies. Mark that detail, because this island has a habit. Someone local opens the door, and the world walks in. The conquest was not fast. It took the better part of a century to subdue the whole island, fortress by fortress. But Palermo fell early, in the year 831, after a siege that contemporary accounts describe as devastating for the population inside. And then the new rulers did something that no power had done in the city's 1500 years of existence. They chose it, not Syracuse, the ancient Greek capital in the east, the city of Archimedes, the seat of Byzantine power. The Arabs made Palermo their capital, and the reasoning was pure geography. Palermo faced Africa. It faced Tunisia, the heart of the new ruler's world. The bay that had once sheltered Carthaginian fleets now looked toward home. For the first time since the fall of Carthage, almost 11 centuries earlier, Palermo was not on the edge of its ruler's map. It was the front door. What happened next is the part of European history that Europe spent centuries forgetting. Palermo exploded. Under Arab rule, the city grew from a provincial Byzantine town into one of the great cities of the Mediterranean world. Travellers' accounts from the 10th century describe a metropolis that stunned them. The geographer Ibn Hawqal, who visited around the year 972, wrote a famous description of the city, counting its districts, its markets, and its mosques. He claimed there were more than 300 mosques in Palermo, a number so high he admitted he had never seen anything like it in any city of comparable size. Modern historians treat his figures with caution, as we should treat all medieval numbers, and no secure population total survives from this era. Estimates vary widely, and some modern scholars place the city above 100,000 people, which would have made Palermo larger than almost any city in the Latin West. For comparison, London, at the same moment, was a town of perhaps 10,000, but size is the least interesting part. Walk through the city Ibn Harkal walked through, because the shape of it explains everything that came later. At the centre stood the old walled heart, which the Arabs called Al-Qasr, the fortress, the ancient core the Phoenicians had founded, now dense with markets and mosques, including the great Friday Mosque built where the Cathedral of Palermo stands today. Down by the water sat a second walled district, Al-Khalisa, the Chosen, a government quarter housing the Emir's palace, the arsenal, and the administration, whose name survives, worn smooth by 1,000 years of Sicilian mouths, as the neighbourhood still called Calsa today. Around these two cores spread the unwalled quarters, the neighbourhoods of merchants and craftsmen, each with its own markets, and the sources describe communities of Muslims, Christians, and Jews living in this sprawl, with churches still operating under the legal protections and special taxes that Islamic law assigned to non-Muslims. Streets were narrow and crowded. Water ran through channels to fountains, gardens, and public baths, and the traveller's accounts linger on those baths the way modern travel writing lingers on restaurants. And the new rulers rebuilt the land itself. They brought with them the agricultural science of the Islamic world, and they transformed the countryside around Palermo with irrigation channels, underground water tunnels of the kind used in Persia and North Africa, and terraced gardens. Into that engineered landscape they introduced, or greatly expanded, crops that would define Sicily forever after: oranges and lemons, sugarcane, rice, mulberries for silk, cotton, pistachios. Historians of agriculture debate exactly which plants were entirely new and which had existed in some limited form before. But no serious account doubts the revolution itself. The plain behind Palermo, ringed by mountains and fed by streams, became so famously lush that it was later called the Conca d'Oro, the golden shell, a name it kept for 1,000 years. Hold that name in your mind, because near the end of this story, the fate of those same orchards will sit at the centre of Palermo's darkest modern chapter. Commerce reorganized around the markets, in the style of the great souks of the Islamic world, and one connection reaches from that lost city directly into the present, the market called Ballarò, which still fills the streets of central Palermo every day with vendors shouting over fish and oranges and spices, is commonly traced back to this era, though historians are careful to note that its exact origins and how continuously it has operated on the same ground we cannot be documented with certainty. What can be said is that Palermo has been a city of street markets since the emirs, and that the vendors' singing style of calling out prices, the abaniera, is popularly associated with the city's Arab past, even if that linguistic connection is impossible to prove. When we finish this story in the 21st century, we will stand in that market again. The island's very sound changed. Sicilian dialect today carries hundreds of words with Arabic roots, in farming, in food, in place names. Dozens of Sicilian towns still bear names built from Arabic words. Food historians trace the ancestry of Sicilian sorbet to techniques of mixing mountain snow with fruit syrups known in the medieval Islamic world. and dishes across the island's kitchen, from its pastries to its street food, show the fingerprints of that era, even where the exact recipes cannot be documented so far back. Was it a golden age of tolerance? We should be careful here, because this is where romantic history likes to run ahead of the evidence. Arab Sicily was not a modern multicultural democracy. Christians and Jews lived under the legal framework common in the Islamic world, protected in their worship but taxed specially and ranked below Muslims in status. There were revolts, and there was internal strife. In the 11th century, the island's Muslim rulers fractured into rival local lords who fought each other openly. What we can say, based on the evidence, is that Arab Palermo was a genuinely mixed city, where Greek Christians, Yevs, and Muslims from Africa, Spain, and the East lived and traded side by side, and where the machinery of daily coexistence worked well enough to make the city rich. That fractured island, wealthy, sophisticated, and politically divided against itself, now enters the 11th century. And the 11th century was a terrible time in the Mediterranean to be rich and divided, because a new people had arrived in southern Italy. They had come from the north as pilgrims and hired swords, and they had discovered that the fragmented south was a land of opportunity for men whose only capital was violence. They were the descendants of Vikings, settled in northern France for a century and baptized into Christianity and the French language. Europe called them Normans, and two brothers among them, sons of a minor lord with too many sons and too little land, were about to look across the water at the richest prize in the central Mediterranean and decide it should belong to them. Chapter 5. The Vikings who became Sultans. The family was called Hauteville, and their story sounds like something a screenwriter would reject as too improbable. A small-time baron in Normandy, Tancred of Hauteville, fathered 12 sons. His lands could support almost none of them, so one after another, the brothers rode south to Italy, where the endless wars between Byzantines, Lombards, and popes created a job market for professional violence. They did not remain employees for long. The Hautevilles had a gift, and it was not just for war. It was for turning chaos into ownership. Within a generation they had gone from hired swords to counts and dukes, carving out territory across southern Italy. The eldest brothers conquered Apulia, and the 2 youngest of the 12, Robert, nicknamed Guiscard, which means something like the cunning, or the fox, and Roger, the baby of the family, turned their attention to the biggest prize in the region, Sicily, Muslim-ruled, fabulously wealthy, and conveniently for the Normans, at war with itself. The invasion began in the year 1061, and the door opened the way it had opened for the Arabs 2 centuries earlier. A Sicilian Muslim lord, losing his own civil war, invited the Normans across the strait as allies. Someone local opened the door. The world walked in. It is the last time in this story you will hear that sentence, and only because the city was about to stop having doors to open. The campaign took 30 years of grinding warfare, but the decisive moment came at Palermo. In the year 1071, Robert and Roger brought their army and fleet against the capital, and after a siege of some 5 months, in January of 1072, the city surrendered. This is the moment where our story began. 2 brothers from Normandy, standing before the gates of a city larger and richer than anything in the world they came from. A city of mosques and gardens and markets that made the towns of Normandy look like villages. And now comes the decision that separates this conquest from almost every other conquest in medieval history. The Normans did not destroy Palermo. They did not expel its people or burn its mosques wholesale or remake it in the image of Normandy. Stand in their boots for a moment, and you can see the cold logic of it. They were a tiny military elite, a few thousand knights at most, sitting on top of an island of hundreds of thousands of people who did not share their language, their religion, or their customs. They could rule as destroyers and inherit ashes, or they could rule as managers and inherit a machine. They chose the machine. The negotiated surrender of Palermo, according to the chroniclers of the conquest, allowed the Muslim population to keep practicing their religion and to be judged by their own laws in their own disputes. Arab administrators kept running the treasury and the land registers, because they were the only ones who knew how. Greek clerks kept drafting documents. The Normans kept the Arab tax system, kept the coinage, kept the irrigation, kept the markets. They took the profits and the throne, and they let Palermo remain Palermo. Robert Guiscard went back to the mainland to pursue other wars, and Sicily fell to the youngest brother, Count Roger, and then to Roger's son. And it is the son who turns this from a successful conquest into one of the marvels of European history. Roger II was born in Sicily. Let that sink in. The son of a Viking-descended adventurer, born on a Mediterranean island, raised in a palace staffed by Greek and Arab officials, tutored in a court where Latin, Greek, and Arabic were all working languages. He was, in a sense, the first true product of the thing his family had accidentally created, not a Norman ruling Sicily, a Sicilian of Norman blood. On Christmas Day of the year 1130, in the Cathedral of Palermo, Roger II was crowned king of a newly invented kingdom, the Kingdom of Sicily. The date was chosen with a sense of history, exactly 330 years earlier. On Christmas Day of the year 800, Charlemagne had been crowned emperor in Rome. Roger was announcing his ambition in the language of ceremony. Palermo had been a capital before, under the emirs, but it had always answered, in the end, to somebody across the water, to Tyre or Carthage or Rome or Constantinople or the courts of North Africa. Roger's kingdom was not free of outside claims either. Its royal title rested on papal recognition, and the relationship between the kings of Sicily and the popes who claimed authority over them would be argued, and occasionally fought over, for generations. But something fundamental had changed. For the first time in its 2,000-year existence, Palermo stood at the centre of a kingdom whose government, wealth, and armies were concentrated on the island itself and reached outward from it, north into the Italian mainland and south across the sea. The taxes flowed in, not out. The city that had spent its whole life working for others finally worked for itself. What Roger built with that wealth, we will walk through in the next chapter, and it includes some of the most breathtaking rooms ever constructed by human hands. But before we go there, look at the man himself, because the king tells you what the kingdom was. His royal mantle survives to this day, and it is one of the most extraordinary objects of the European Middle Ages. It was made in the royal workshop of Palermo in the 1130s. Red silk, embroidered in gold, with a design of lions triumphing over camels, and around its border runs an inscription in Arabic, in beautiful Kufic script, blessing the king and dating the garment by the Islamic calendar. A Christian king's ceremonial mantle, praising him in the language of the Quran. Centuries later, The Holy Roman Emperors of Germany were still being crowned wearing it, most of them likely unaware of what the Arabic actually said. His government spoke 3 languages. His navy was commanded by an official who carried an Arabic title, Emir of Emirs, and the Arabic administrative vocabulary of Norman Sicily fed into the medieval European word that became admiral, a word whose exact path historians of language still trace with care. His court welcomed the geographer al-Idrisi, a Muslim scholar of Andalusian origin, who spent years compiling for Roger one of the greatest works of medieval geography, a description and map of the entire known world, from Britain to China, known ever afterward as the Book of Roger. When it was completed, according to the traditional account, it was engraved on a massive disc of silver, a Christian king's name on a Muslim scholar's map of the world. Some historians looking at all this have used a striking phrase for the Hautville rulers of Sicily, the baptized sultans, their palace culture, their gardens, their ceremonial distance from their subjects owed as much to the emirs of Cairo and Tunis as to any king of France. Contemporary visitors from northern Europe were sometimes dazzled and sometimes scandalized. Palermo's court did not look like Christendom. It looked like itself. Every conqueror who ever took Palermo believed they were changing the city. Every time. The city changed them faster. The Phoenician trading post absorbed Carthage's empire. The Roman province quietly outlived Rome. And now the descendants of Vikings, the most feared warriors in Europe, had come to Sicily and, within 1 generation, turned into something the world had never seen. Not Norman, not Arab, not Greek, Palermitan. The city swallows its conquerors. That is its superpower. And the 12th century was about to become its greatest demonstration. Because Roger's kingdom was not just going to be rich. For about 1 human lifetime, this island held arguably the most sophisticated court in Europe. The one place on the continent where the 3 civilizations of the Mediterranean, Latin, Greek, and Arab, worked side by side in the same government, prayed in the same city, and built together monuments that still stop human hearts 900 years later. That golden moment, how it worked, why it dazzled the world, and the quiet cracks that would bring it all down, is the next chapter of our story. Chapter 6. The Kingdom Written in 3 Languages. Walk into the Palatine Chapel in Palermo today, and your eyes will not know where to rest. It is the royal chapel of the Norman palace, built for Roger II in the 1130s and 40s, and it is quite possibly the most concentrated argument for civilization ever fitted into a single room. The walls and the dome blaze with Byzantine mosaics, Christ and his angels rendered in gold glass by Greek craftsmen. The floors and the lower walls are woven with geometric inlays of coloured marble in patterns that would be at home in Cairo. And then you look up, and above the Christian mosaics, covering the entire ceiling of the central nave, is something that should not exist. Mukarnas ceiling, an intricate honeycomb of carved and painted wood, a masterpiece of Islamic art, filled with hundreds of painted scenes, musicians, dancers, drinkers, hunters, some with inscriptions in Arabic, an Islamic ceiling, celebrating earthly pleasures, floating over the royal chapel of a Christian king. Whatever political message Roger intended by that combination, and royal buildings always carry messages. The chapel also records something intensely practical. The King of Sicily hired the best artists available. The best artists available were Greek, Arab, and Latin, and nobody in Palermo thought that was strange. That is the point. The coexistence of Norman Sicily was not an ideology. Nobody in the 12th century wrote essays about diversity. It was a practice, a working arrangement, and it existed because it was useful, profitable, and, for about 3 generations, stable. Look at how the machine actually ran. The royal administration issued documents in Latin, Greek, and Arabic depending on who needed to read them. The treasury, the office that kept the kingdom rich, ran substantially on Arabic bookkeeping and personnel, and its very name in the sources, the Diwan, is an Arabic word. Tax registers listed villages and boundaries in multiple languages. Greek monasteries received royal charters. Mosques operated. The Jewish community of Palermo lived and worked in its own quarter near the port. And the Spanish Jewish traveller Benjamin of Tudela, who journeyed across the Mediterranean in the 1160s and 70s, described Palermo in his travel account as a great city with a substantial Jewish community, alongside its Muslims and Christians, and the kingdom this machine supported was a Mediterranean power of the first rank. Roger's fleets, commanded by his formidable minister George of Antioch, a Greek Christian who had begun his career serving Muslim rulers in North Africa, raided and briefly held stretches of the Tunisian coast. Sicilian grain, silk, and gold moved through Palermo's harbour. The Royal Silk Workshop, staffed in part, according to the chroniclers, by weavers seized in raids on Byzantine Greece, produced textiles for royalty across Europe. The monuments of this age still crowd Palermo, and in the year 2015, UNESCO inscribed the Arab-Norman buildings of Palermo and the cathedrals of nearby Cefalù and Monreale on the World Heritage List, describing them as the record of a unique meeting of Western, Islamic, and Byzantine traditions. The greatest of them all stands on the hill above the city, the Cathedral of Monreale, built in the 1170s and 80s by Roger's grandson, King William II, is one of those buildings no photograph has ever done justice. Its interior is covered by one of the largest cycles of mosaics in the world, thousands of square meters of gold, an entire Bible told in pictures, executed by masters in the Byzantine tradition. Beside it stands a cloister whose hundreds of paired columns, each pair carved differently, mix Latin, Islamic, and Greek motifs like a stone summary of the kingdom itself. Why does a place like this get built? Monreale was finished in a hurry, on a royal scale, by a young king who was also pointedly placing a new archbishopric right next to Palermo, in tension with the powerful archbishop of the capital. Even the Golden Age was political. It usually is, but by the time Monreale's mosaics were being set, the cracks were already running through the foundation, and this is the part of the story that matters most, because the fall of this Sicily is a case study in how such arrangements die, not with one dramatic betrayal, but by erosion. The balance had always depended on numbers and on the crown. Muslims had been the majority or near majority on the island under the first Norman rulers, and Sicily still held a large Muslim population deep into the 12th century. But decade by decade, settlers arrived from mainland Italy, Lombards and others, encouraged by the crown to populate the interior. The demographic balance tipped. Riots and massacres of Muslims broke out in the 1160s during moments of political crisis. Muslims increasingly withdrew into the island's western hills. Each community, feeling the ground shift, trusted the others a little less. The working arrangement that no one had ever written down began to unravel, and precisely because no one had ever written it down. No one could repair it. The dynasty itself ran out of heirs. William II died young in 1189 without a legitimate child, and after a struggle, the crown of Sicily passed by marriage to the most powerful family in Europe, the Hohenstaufen emperors of Germany, and from that marriage came the last, strangest, most brilliant ruler of this whole tradition, Frederick II, grandson of a Norman king through his mother, grandson of the German Emperor Barbarossa through his father, orphaned as a small child, raised in Palermo, king of Sicily from the age of 3, and eventually Holy Roman Emperor, king of Jerusalem, and the wonder and scandal of his age. His contemporaries called him Stupor Mundi, the astonishment of the world. He spoke, according to the accounts of his era, 6 languages. He kept a menagerie of exotic animals that he paraded across Europe, elephants and leopards and a giraffe. He wrote, himself, a treatise on falconry that modern scholars still admire as a landmark of observational science. He founded the University of Naples. He conducted a crusade in which, instead of fighting, he negotiated with the Sultan of Egypt and recovered Jerusalem for Christendom by treaty, an achievement that scandalized the Pope more than a defeat would have. He looks, from a distance, like the perfect heir of multicultural Palermo, and in his court culture he was Arabic learning, Greek science, and the first school of poetry in the Italian language all flourished around him. Dante himself, 2 generations later, credited the Sicilian school at Frederick's court as the birthplace of Italian poetry. But an honest telling has to put the other side plainly. The same Frederick ended Islamic Sicily, facing repeated revolts by the Muslim communities in the island's western mountains. Frederick made a decision that was ruthless even by the standards of his time, over roughly 2 decades, beginning in the 1220s. He deported much of Sicily's remaining Muslim population, tens of thousands of people by the estimates of historians, to a single inland colony at Lucera on the Italian mainland. There, in exile, they served the crown, ironically, as his most loyal soldiers and craftsmen. A Muslim city in Italy serving a Christian emperor. It lasted until the year 1300, when a later king destroyed it and its people were killed, enslaved, or scattered. That is how roughly 4 centuries of organized Muslim life in Sicily came to an end. Not in a battle, in an administrative removal, carried out over 20 years, ordered by the most cultured man in Europe. If you came to this chapter for a warm story about tolerance, that ending feels like a betrayal. I would argue it is the most valuable lesson in this entire story. Palermo's golden age proves that radically different communities can run a brilliant civilization together. Its ending proves that such arrangements are not self-sustaining. They remained secure while the crown continued to protect them. And once that protection turned hostile, custom and profit were not enough to save them. What was missing was not goodwill. It was institutions strong enough to survive a hostile king. Frederick died in the year 1250. Within a generation, his dynasty was exterminated. His descendants, hunted down by a new power, invited into Italy by the popes to destroy the Hohenstaufen line. The winner was a French prince, Charles of Anjou, brother of the King of France, who took the crown of Sicily by conquest in 1266 and moved the kingdom's centre of gravity away from Palermo to Naples. French officials and French garrisons arrived in Sicily. Taxes rose to pay for the new king's wars. 16 years passed, and then, On the Monday after Easter in the year 1282, outside a church on the southern edge of Palermo, as the light was fading, the bells began to ring for evening prayer. Chapter 7. The Bell That Started a Massacre. Easter Monday, the 30th of March, 1282, outside the walls of Palermo, at the Church of the Holy Spirit. A crowd has gathered in the late afternoon for the festival, waiting for Vespers, the evening prayer. There are French soldiers among the crowd. The kingdom has been under Charles of Anjou for 16 years, and Palermo has felt every one of them. In taxes squeezed for the king's foreign wars, in confiscation, in the arrogance of an occupying garrison, in the simple daily humiliation of being ruled by men who did not bother to learn the language. What happened next comes down to us through chronicles written afterward, and they differ in details, so the traditional account should be told as what it is, the story the Sicilians themselves preserved. A French sergeant, named in the chronicles as Drouet, accosted a young married woman, putting his hands on her under the pretext of searching for weapons. Her husband struck him down. The French soldiers drew their swords. The crowd fell on them and killed them all. And at that moment, the bells of Palermo began ringing for Vespers, and they did not stop, and their sound became the signal for something that had clearly been waiting under the surface for years. The people of Palermo went through the city hunting the French. The chronicles describe them running through the streets crying "Death to the French," breaking into houses, inns, and monasteries, according to accounts repeated by historians ever since. The rebels identified their victims by language, holding up chickpeas, ciciri in Sicilian, and demanding people say the word, because the French could not pronounce it correctly. Whether that test was used as widely as legend claims, we cannot verify, but it captures a truth about what this was: a massacre organized around identity, around the line between us and them. By the accounts of the time, some 2,000 French men and women were killed in Palermo within days, and as the revolt spread across the island through April, the French population of Sicily was slaughtered or expelled almost entirely. Only a few commanders known for justice were spared, and one town reportedly let its French garrison depart in peace. Europe was stunned. This was not a baronial coup or a palace conspiracy. This was a city, and then an island, of commoners rising against one of the most feared royal houses in Europe and annihilating its presence in a matter of weeks. The event went into history under the name of the hour it began, the Sicilian Vespers. For the first time in this entire story, nearly 2,000 years into the city's existence, Palermo had refused, not maneuvered, not absorbed, not outweighted, refused, with its hands. The city that survived by swallowing its conquerors had finally met one it could not digest, and the world learned that Sicilian patience, which everyone mistook for passivity, had a bottom. But revolutions are easy to start and hard to steer, and what Palermo did next tells you everything about the difference between rage and power. The rebel cities first tried to organize themselves as free communes under the protection of the Pope, a Sicilian republic in embryo. The Pope, who was a political ally of Charles of Anjou, refused them flatly and excommunicated the rebels. Charles was already assembling his fleet to retake the island and make an example of it. The Sicilians needed a protector with an army and a navy, and they needed one immediately. So they turned to the one royal house with a claim to the old kingdom. They offered the crown to Peter III of Aragon, in Spain, whose wife Constance was the granddaughter of Frederick II. the last living link to the Hohenstaufen line, Peter, whose fleet was conveniently already at sea off North Africa, and whose advisers, many suspected then and historians have debated since, may have been in contact with Sicilian conspirators before the revolt ever began. Accepted. He landed at Trapani in August of 1282 and was acclaimed king. The War of the Sicilian Vespers lasted 20 years, ending with a peace in 1302 that left Sicily under the House of Aragon. But the larger struggle it opened, between the island and the Angevin kingdom of Naples across the strait, flared and faded in changing forms for generations afterward, and the two crowns that had once been a single kingdom spent the better part of a century glaring at each other across 3 miles of water. Now the accounting, and I want to be fair to both sides of it. The Vespers brought Palermo things that mattered. The island was never again ruled by the House of Anjou. Sicily kept its own crown and its own parliament, one of the oldest in Europe. For over a century after the revolt, it even had something it had not known since the Norman kings, rulers who actually lived on the island, an Aragonese branch dynasty holding court in Sicily itself, and the memory of successful revolt became part of the island's identity for 7 centuries. 19th century Italian patriots would invoke the Vespers. Verdi wrote an opera about it. The event became a permanent proof, in the Sicilian mind, that the island could not be held against its will. But look at the price with clear eyes. The resident kings did not last. Their line thinned and failed, and by the early 1400s, the crown of Sicily had folded back into the main Aragonese inheritance, governed from Barcelona and Naples. And when Aragon merged with Castile at the end of the 15th century, Sicily became one province of the global empire of Spain. The rescue of 1282 had hardened, by slow degrees, into an arrangement in which Palermo would once again be governed through dynasties whose political centres lay somewhere else. The kingdom's parliament survived, but as the centuries passed it became a club of barons approving taxes. The island's trade drifted into the hands of foreign merchants, and the crown that Sicilians had offered as a gift became, in the ledgers of distant capitals, simply another possession, administered by viceroys, governed by correspondents, remembered mostly when money was needed. The city had proven it could expel an empire. It had not solved the older problem, the one built into its position on the map, that it was too valuable to be left alone and too small to stand alone. Those next centuries are the quietest part of this story, and the most dangerous to skip, because in that long silence, while Palermo's harbour slowly emptied and its barons perfected the art of doing nothing, the countryside behind the city was developing habits, arrangements, and silences of its own. The machine described in Chapter 3, absentee lords, unaccountable middlemen, powerless peasants, was about to be rebuilt, piece by piece, under new flags. And this time, when the machine finally broke, what crawled out of it would have a name. Chapter 8. 400 years in the waiting room. In the summer of 1647, a goldsmith walked into the middle of a revolution. His name was Giuseppe d'Alessi, and he was nobody, a craftsman of Palermo, a man who had spent time in prison, a man whose name appears in no royal ledger before that summer. The city around him was starving. The harvest had failed. The price of bread had climbed beyond the reach of the poor, and the government's answer had been to shrink the loaf while keeping the price. In May, a marketplace crowd had exploded, storming the offices of the hated flour taxes, and for weeks the city hung between riot and revolt, Out of that chaos, the guilds and the crowds pushed forward this goldsmith, who turned out to have something the barons feared far more than hunger: a program, tax relief for the poor, a share of city government for the guilds, limits on the men who had run Palermo from a comfortable distance, for as long as anyone living could remember. For a few extraordinary weeks, D'Alessi effectively led Palermo. Then the barons and their allies did what they always did. They waited, they divided, they bought, and in August he was betrayed and killed, his head displayed, his reforms cancelled one by one. A parallel revolt in Naples, led by a fisherman named Masaniello, ended the same way in almost the same months. The message settled over the poor of both cities like dust. The state was not theirs. Rising against it ended in blood. Keep that goldsmith in mind, because his story is the whole story of these centuries in miniature. Now let me rewind and show you the machine that crushed him, because this chapter is where the deep machinery of modern Sicily gets built. It is the least cinematic chapter in this story, and it may be the most important. Everything in the final third is assembled here. Quietly, in the waiting room, start with the basic arrangement. After the wars of the Vespers burned out and the island's resident Aragonese kings died away, Sicily folded into the inheritance of Aragon. And when Aragon and Castile merged into the Kingdom of Spain at the end of the 15th century, Sicily became one province of a global empire, ruled from Madrid through an appointed viceroy in Palermo. Consider what that meant in practice. The king was more than 1,000 miles away. With only a handful of exceptions across the centuries, he would never visit. His viceroy served a few years and moved on. The island was governed, in the most literal sense, by correspondence. Now the question this whole story keeps asking: when the state is distant, who actually runs things? In Sicily, the answer was the barons. The crown needed two things from the island: taxes and quiet, and it discovered early that the cheapest way to get both was to let the local aristocracy do as it pleased on its own lands. The great families acquired rights that made them little kings in the countryside. Many held the power of justice over their own territories, meaning the baron or his appointed judge was the law for the peasants on his estates. The parliament that Sicilians were so proud of survived, but it had become, in effect, an assembly of these same landowners, negotiating tax donations to the crown in exchange for confirmation of their privileges. The crown got its money. The barons got their immunity. The bargain held for centuries because it worked. For everyone who had a seat at the table, and now the detail that connects everything, the one to carry into the final chapters. The barons themselves increasingly did not live on their lands. The 17th century saw the Sicilian aristocracy migrate into Palermo, drawn by the viceregal court, by prestige, by the sheer pleasure of the capital, and they built the palaces that still line the old streets. Their estates in the interior, the enormous wheat latifundia rolling across the island's empty heart, were rented out to managers. The Sicilians called such a manager a gabellotto, from the word for the lease he held. He squeezed the peasants, paid the baron, and kept the difference, to enforce his will across empty miles of countryside. He hired armed men, field guards, enforcers, men whose authority came not from any state, but from the private power they served. Absentee owners, unaccountable middlemen, private armed enforcement, a distant government that asked no questions as long as the money arrived. You have seen this machine before. In Chapter 3, Under Rome, whether the old Roman pattern truly survived underground or was simply reinvented because the same incentives produced the same structures. Historians genuinely debate. What no one disputes is what these centuries normalized in the Sicilian countryside: the conviction that real power is local, personnel, and armed, and that the official state is a distant rumor to be managed rather than obeyed. Meanwhile, inside the walls, Palermo lived a strange double life. It was politically powerless and physically magnificent. The viceroys and the aristocracy poured money into appearances, and Baroque Palermo was born. In the year 1600, the viceroy drove a long straight street through the medieval fabric, and where it crossed the ancient main road, the city built the Quattro Canti, the Four Corners, a theatrical octagonal crossroads of fountains and statues that still forms the heart of the old city. Palermo perfected its festivals in these years. Above all, the annual festino of Saint Rosalia, the plague saint whose relics, discovered on the mountain above the city in 1624 during an epidemic, were credited with ending it. Her festival became one of the great spectacles of Europe, and it is still held every July. The city learned to perform splendor while deciding nothing. Style as a substitute for power. It is a survival skill, and Palermo mastered it. But the splendor had a bill, and the poor paid it. Sicily's grain economy, the island's ancient strength, stagnated while northern Europe modernized. Taxes climbed as Spain bled itself in continental wars. When the system failed, it failed downward, onto the bread of the poor, which is how a goldsmith briefly became the most powerful man in Palermo, and why he died for it. 9 years after D'Alessi's head came down, a blow arrived that no one could revolt against. The plague of 1656 devastated the city, killing, by the estimates historians cite, tens of thousands of Palermitans in a matter of months. Between famine, plague, and flight to the countryside, the proud capital entered the 18th century diminished, ornate, and exhausted. Then, afar away, the empires reshuffled the deck again. Without asking, Spain's ruling dynasty died out. Europe fought a continental war over the inheritance, and at the Peace of Utrecht in 1713, Sicily was handed to the Duke of Savoy from northern Italy. 7 years later, it was traded to Austria. In 1734, a Spanish Bourbon prince, Charles, conquered southern Italy and took Sicily for himself, founding the dynasty that would rule from Naples. With one brief interruption, for the next century and a quarter, Palermo greeted each new flag with ceremonies and fireworks. What else was there to do? In 21 years, the island had been governed by 4 different crowns, and not one of them had asked a single Sicilian for an opinion. Under the Naples Bourbons, Sicily was no longer even a province of a world empire. It was the junior half of a small kingdom, ruled by a court across the water that visited mainly when Naples was unsafe. When Napoleon's armies took Naples, the Bourbon court twice fled to Palermo under the protection of the British Navy, and for a moment, with British encouragement, the island even received a modern constitution in 1812, which abolished feudal law on paper. When Napoleon fell, the king returned to Naples and the constitution was discarded. The feudal titles faded, but the land, the latifundia, the gabelotti, the armed guards, all remained exactly where they were. Count the years. By the middle of the 19th century, Palermo had been governed through dynasties centered somewhere else for the better part of 6 centuries. It had revolted repeatedly. Under the Bourbons alone, The island rose in 1820 and again in 1848, when Palermo drove out the royal garrison and ran its own government for over a year before the kingdom's forces returned and put the revolution down. Each time, the reforms were revoked afterward. An entire people had concluded, from centuries of consistent evidence, that government was a foreign weather system. You do not negotiate with weather. You build a roof. The roofs Sicilians built were family, patronage, silence, and private arrangement. Remember those 4 words. On the 11th of May, 1860, 2 battered steamships came over the horizon and dropped anchor at Marsala. Chapter 9. The Redshirts and the Broken Promise. They carried roughly 1,000 volunteers in red shirts, and their commander was Giuseppe Garibaldi, soldier, revolutionary, and one of the most famous fighting men alive, a celebrity on both sides of the Atlantic, whose portrait was printed and sold from London to New York, who had led guerrilla campaigns in South America and defended the Roman Republic of 1849. His goal was nothing less than the unification of Italy, and he had chosen to begin it at the weakest point of the old order, Bourbon Sicily. On paper, the expedition was absurd. 1,000 poorly armed volunteers against a Bourbon garrison on the island that numbered, by the standard accounts, some 20,000 or more regular troops. But Garibaldi was not counting on his 1,000. He was counting on Sicily, and Sicily delivered. Peasant bands and local squads swelled his ranks. 4 days after landing, he beat a Bourbon force at Calatafimi, a small battle with enormous psychological effect. Then, instead of avoiding the island's fortified capital, he marched on it. What happened at Palermo at the end of May of 1860 is one of the most improbable military episodes of the century. Garibaldi fainted, slipped his force through the mountains, and entered the city from the southeast at dawn on the 27th of May. The population rose with him. Barricades went up in the streets, and for 3 days the city fought while Bourbon warships and the fortress bombarded neighborhoods into rubble. Then, with the rebels' ammunition nearly gone, by the accounts of Garibaldi's own officers, the Bourbon command, demoralized and confused, asked for a truce. The garrison, still vastly outnumbering the rebels, evacuated the capital, Palermo. The city that had rung the bells of the Vespers had risen again, and this time it had won. Within months, Garibaldi took the whole island and crossed to the mainland. By the autumn, the Bourbon kingdom had collapsed, and in October of 1860, Sicilians voted in a plebiscite on joining the new Kingdom of Italy under Victor Emmanuel II of Savoy. The official result was astonishing. Over 430,000 votes in favour and only a few hundred against. That result cannot be read as a free modern referendum. The vote was public. Expectations were enormous, and opposition was not exactly safe to express. But there is little doubt about the genuine enthusiasm of that moment. After centuries of rule from elsewhere, Sicilians believed they were finally joining something as founders rather than subjects. Now comes the turn, and if you have followed this story from the beginning, you can feel it coming. Unified Italy was built as a centralized state, governed from the north, first from Turin, and its new rulers looked south with a mixture of ignorance and alarm. Northern officials arrived carrying northern laws, northern taxes, and northern conscription, and they applied them to an island they did not understand and, in many documented cases, did not respect. Many Sicilians soon experienced the new state as heavier than the old one. The new tax burden, including a hated levy on milled grain that fell directly on bread. The food of the poor. Bit deeper than Bourbon taxation had. Conscription took sons from peasant families for years of military service far away. A systematic obligation of a kind the island had not known under the Bourbons. And when draft evaders fled to the hills, the state sent soldiers to hunt them. In 1866, Palermo itself rose yet again, in a week-long revolt that the Italian military helped suppress with naval bombardment. 6 years after the city had fought to join Italy. And the land, the one thing that could have changed peasant life, went through a transformation that reads like a bitter joke. The new state confiscated and auctioned vast church properties, and reformers imagined a Sicily of small farmers. But auctions favour people with money and connections. The Gabalotti, the estate managers and their allies, bought heavily. The old baronial system did not die. It changed owners and dropped the aristocratic manners. So look at Sicily in the 1860s and 70s. A distant government. Taxes flowing out. Local armed power filling the vacuum. All of it familiar. Except one thing was genuinely new. The old order had at least been stable. The new one was contested, chaotic, and full of opportunity. Elections to influence, property changing hands, contracts, courts, votes, and in exactly that chaos, in the orchards and estates around Palermo, the private enforcers, the middlemen, the men who could guarantee outcomes when the state could not, began organizing into something more ambitious than anything the countryside had seen before. But first, the people made their own answer to the broken promise. And it is the reason this story is personal for millions of you watching. They left. It began as a trickle in the 1870s and became, by the 1890s and the first years of the 20th century, one of the largest emigrations from any region in European history. The numbers historians cite are staggering. In the 2.5 decades before the First World War, well over 1 million Sicilians departed. From an island whose entire population was around 3.5 million, whole villages emptied of their young men. They went to Argentina, to Brazil, to Tunisia. Above all, they went to the United States, through the halls of Ellis Island, into the tenements of New York, the docks of New Orleans, the markets of Chicago, came the descendants of generations shaped by concentrated land, rural poverty, and distrust of every government they had ever known. They carried almost nothing, a dialect full of Arabic words, a cuisine built on eggplant and citrus and memory, and a conviction, older than Italy itself, that in the end, the only thing that protects you is your family. If your family came to America from Sicily, and hundreds of thousands did, then everything you have heard in the last 8 chapters is the story that ends where your family photographs begin. One closing thought, because it is the hinge of this entire story. In 1860, Sicily made the largest act of trust in its recorded history. It embraced the promise of a new nation with extraordinary enthusiasm, for the first time in 3,000 years believing it was joining something rather than being taken by it. Within 1 generation, that trust was gone, and 1 million people had voted on the failure with their feet. The ones who stayed needed protection, order, and justice, and the state provided none of them. Something else stepped forward to sell all 3. Chapter 10. The Business of Protection. In 1863, 3 years after Garibaldi's Redshirts stormed the city, a play opened in Palermo and became a runaway hit. It was called I Mafiosi di la Vicaria. Roughly, the mafiosi of the Vicaria prison. It portrayed a gang of inmates inside Palermo's great jail. Men with their own code, their own hierarchy, their own tax on other prisoners. Men who spoke of respect and humility, and who commanded more real authority inside those walls than the guards did. The play was so popular it toured Italy for decades. And now a strange, important fact. Before that play, the word mafia barely appears in any written record. Within a few years of it, the word was everywhere. In police reports, in parliamentary debates, in newspapers. In 1865, a prefect of Palermo used it in an official dispatch to Rome, warning about a criminal association operating in the province. The thing itself was older than its fame, but it was in exactly this decade, the chaotic first decade of Italian Sicily, that the state discovered it was sharing the island with a rival. Where did the word come from? The honest answer is that nobody knows for certain. Some linguists have proposed roots in Arabic words suggesting boldness or protection. Others point to Palermo street slang, where mafioso meant something like swaggering, beautiful, self-confident. What matters more than the etymology is what the word captured, a whole style of power, and the fact that official Italy, for more than a century afterward, would argue about whether the organization even existed. Before we go one step further, let me say something plainly, because the whole architecture of this story depends on it. Nothing in Sicily's ancient or medieval history made the mafia inevitable. No people is destined to produce such a thing. The mafia emerged from distinctly modern conditions. A new state too weak and too distant to enforce its own laws. A sudden revolution in property, markets, and elections, and a countryside already full of private armed power. The old structures we have traced across this story, the latifundia, the gabelotti, the habit of distrust, mattered because the new state failed to replace them. That is the connection, not fate, failure. So what actually was the mafia? Here we are lucky, because the single best early answer comes from an eyewitness with no romantic illusions. In 1876, two young Tuscan aristocrats, Leopoldo Franchetti and Sidney Sonnino, travelled through Sicily conducting a private investigation into the island's conditions. The report Franchetti published remains, to this day, one of the foundational documents of mafia studies, and his conclusion was disturbing precisely because it was so unsentimental. He did not describe bandits in the hills. He described what he called an industry of violence, run by violent entrepreneurs of the middle class, respectable men, estate managers, orchard guards, brokers who sold protection, enforced monopolies, fixed disputes, and delivered votes, all in the vacuum the state had left. Violence, in Franchetti's analysis, was not a breakdown of the local economy, it was a branch of it. And notice where this industry ran hottest, not in the poorest, emptiest interior, but in some of the richest agriculture in Sicily. The lemon and orange groves of the Conca d'Oro, the golden shell around Palermo. A study by the economists Arcangelo Dimico, Alessia Isopi, and Ulla Olsen, published in the Journal of Economic History in 2017, tested this pattern against 19th century data and found that early mafia presence tracked closely with citrus-growing towns. The logic is almost elegant. In the 1880s, citrus was among the most profitable crops in Europe, partly because the British Navy bought lemon juice to prevent scurvy. But citrus is fragile wealth. A grove takes years to mature. Fruit can be stolen in a night. Water rights can be cut. A reputation can be destroyed. High value plus vulnerability equals demand for protection, and the men selling protection made sure the demand never went away, because they were often the same men who organized the theft you needed protecting from. That was one cradle. It was not the only one. Researchers have documented early mafia-style power in the sulfur mining districts of the island's south, where Sicily supplied a huge share of the world's sulfur in the 19th century, in the control of scarce water for irrigation, in cattle rustling and the meat markets, in urban construction, and above all in elections, where a boss who could deliver a district's votes owned a piece of every politician who needed them. The mafia was never one business. It was a method, the sale of guaranteed outcomes in a society where nothing official could be trusted, applied wherever money and uncertainty met. The method ran on rules that sound like folklore but functioned like law. The code of silence toward authorities, omerta, initiation rituals, which police informants described as early as the 1870s, in remarkably consistent detail. A burned saint's image, an oath, a drop of blood, families, each controlling a territory, and above all, the presumption that every dispute, every business, every election in the territory owed the organization its cut and its deference. One more thing made it so hard to kill, and Franchetti named this too. It was not at war with the ruling class. It was intertwined with it. Mafiosi delivered votes to politicians. Politicians provided protection from prosecution, and the exchange reached from village councils to, eventually, the Parliament in Rome. In 1893, the former Director General of the Bank of Sicily, Emanuele Notarbartolo, an aristocrat who had tried to clean up the bank's finances, was stabbed to death on a train outside Palermo. The investigation pointed toward a sitting member of parliament with documented mafia connections, Raffaele Palizzolo. He was convicted, then acquitted on retrial, and the murder officially remains without a legally established mastermind. Sicilians took note of the lesson. The mafia could kill a banker of the establishment in daylight and walk away. Historians often count Notarbartolo as the first of the excellent cadavers, the distinguished corpses. Remember that phrase. It returns, terribly, near the end of our story. For 60 years after unification, Italian governments alternated between denouncing the mafia and doing business with it at election time. Then came a government that did not need elections. Benito Mussolini visited Sicily in 1924, and according to the accounts of the era, some local bosses made the mistake of treating him like every previous Roman politician, something to be managed. The dictator took it as an insult and a challenge. Fascism could not tolerate a rival authority, not out of virtue, but out of monopoly. Mussolini sent to Sicily a hard, ambitious prefect named Cesare Mori, granting him extraordinary powers. And from 1925, Mori waged what amounted to a military campaign against the mafia. His methods were the methods of a police state, mass arrests sweeping up thousands, entire towns besieged. The town of Ganghi, surrounded in 1926, and its fugitives starved out, hostages taken from families, confessions extracted by means the regime did not scruple over, trials with hundreds of defendants in cages. Did it work? On the surface, remarkably, reported violent crime collapsed, and the regime declared the mafia destroyed. Under the surface, historians have documented a more cynical reality. Many bosses emigrated, quite a few of them to the United States. a detail with enormous consequences for American history. Others simply bent, made their peace with the party, and waited. And the deep structure, the latifundia, the gabellotti, the culture of private power, fascism never touched, because the regime had allied itself with the very landowning class the system served. The record of those years deserves a plain statement. The fascist campaign achieved a visible and temporary suppression of mafia activity, and it did so by replacing private coercion with state coercion on a vastly larger scale, applied without law, without appeal, and without distinction between the guilty and the convenient. The lesson is not that dictatorship works. The lesson is that organized crime of this kind thrives where the state is weak, corrupt, or selective in whom it protects, and weakens only where institutions are both capable and legitimate at the same time. The tragedy of Sicily was that it had almost never been offered both at once. In 1943, it briefly seemed the island might finally get them, delivered, of all things, by an invasion. Instead, the mafia was about to receive the greatest gift of its entire history. Chapter 11. Liberation and the Vacuum. In the early summer of 1943, Palermo learned what it meant to matter to a world war. The city was a major Axis port, and Allied bombers hammered it for months. The raids of May 1943 were among the heaviest suffered by any Italian city, and by the time they ended, according to post-war assessments, a large share of Palermo's housing was damaged or destroyed. The port was wrecked, the historic centre was gutted, and tens of thousands had fled to the countryside. Some of those bomb scars, and this is an astonishing fact, remained visible in the old city for the rest of the 20th century, ruins still standing decades later, like an unhealed wound. Keep that detail. It is evidence in a crime we have not reached yet. On the 10th of July, 1943, American, British, and Canadian forces landed on Sicily's southern coasts, the largest amphibious operation of the war to that point. Patton's 7th Army swung west and entered Palermo on the 22nd of July to cheering crowds. 38 days after the landings, organized Axis resistance on the island ended, and Sicily passed from fascist rule to Allied military government. Now we arrive at one of the most famous stories ever told about Sicily, and I owe you the truth about it. The legend says that American intelligence struck a deal with the imprisoned New York boss, Lucky Luciano, that the American mafia ordered its Sicilian cousins to smooth the invasion, and that the island fell so quickly because the mafia handed it over. It is a fantastic story. It is also, in the judgment of most historians who have examined the records, largely a myth, at least in its dramatic form. What is documented is narrower. United States naval intelligence did work with Luciano's associates to protect the New York waterfront from sabotage, and Luciano's sentence was indeed commuted after the war, with his wartime cooperation cited. On Sicily itself, no credible document shows the mafia delivering the island, but the myth distracts from what actually happened, which was worse, because it was not a secret plot. It happened in the open, through ordinary administrative decisions. The Allied occupation government needed local administrators immediately, and it needed men untainted by fascism. And who in Sicily could claim persecution by the fascist regime? The men Cesare Mori had jailed, in town after town, according to the post-war accounts and investigations. Men of mafia background or mafia connections stepped into mayors' offices and food distribution boards. The most cited example is Calogero Vicini, the boss of the town of Villalba, who emerged as mayor during the occupation period in circumstances long held up as the clearest illustration of how men with mafia authority moved into local administration, and who spent the post-war years being treated by the press as the venerable head of the honoured society. Whatever the mafia had or had not done for the invasion, the occupation's practical choices handed it something Mussolini had taken away and the liberal state before him had never fully given: official positions inside the state itself. The next few years were chaos of a very Sicilian kind. A separatist movement demanding independence flared, with some mafia support. Banditry exploded in the countryside, and the most famous bandit, Salvatore Giuliano, a photogenic outlaw treated by international magazines as a Sicilian Robin Hood, ended up entangled with separatists, mafiosi, and, many suspected, darker patrons. On the 1st of May, 1947, gunmen under Giuliano's command opened fire on a peaceful workers' May Day gathering at Portella della Ginestra, killing 11 people, including children. Who truly ordered that massacre, and why, has been debated in courtrooms and books ever since without a conclusive answer. Giuliano himself was found shot dead in 1950, and even his death remains wrapped in contradictions. What is certain is what the era demonstrated. In post-war Sicily, peasant organizers who demanded land reform kept getting killed. By the count of historians, dozens of union leaders and activists in those years, and the killers were almost never punished. Then the countryside stopped being where the money was, and the mafia proved, once and for all, that it was never really about tradition. It followed the money into the city, into concrete. Italy's post-war boom reached Palermo in the 1950s as a flood of construction. The city needed rebuilding. Remember the bomb damage. And it was swelling with migrants from the interior. Public money poured in, and City Hall fell into the hands of a political machine. Most notoriously, the young public works assessor Vito Ciancimino, originally from the mafia stronghold of Corleone, and the Christian Democrat power broker Salvo Lima, both of whom would later be formally identified in court proceedings and parliamentary reports as linked to Cosa Nostra. Ciancimino was eventually convicted. Lima's fate waits at the end of this story. What followed has a name that Italians use without irony: the sack of Palermo. In roughly 2 decades, the garden belt around the city, the Conca d'Oro, the golden shell of citrus that the Arabs had planted 1,000 years earlier and that had given the mafia its first great market, was buried under concrete. Art Nouveau villas along the elegant avenues were demolished, sometimes overnight, before preservation orders could arrive, and replaced with cheap apartment blocks. By the counts later cited in investigations and by urban historians, thousands of building permits issued in those years were concentrated in the hands of a tiny number of front men, some of them literally illiterate pensioners standing in for mafia contractors. Meanwhile, the bombed historic centre, the heart of 3,000 years of history, was left to rot, its population pushed into the new suburbs, because there was more profit in new construction than in restoration. The ruins you could still see decades after the war were not an accident of poverty. They were a business decision. Sit with the irony for a moment, because history rarely writes it this cleanly. The orchards that had made the protection business rich were destroyed by the protection business. The moment concrete paid better than lemons. Tradition, honour, the old rural code, all of it went under the bulldozers without a second thought. Whatever the mafia tells itself, it has only ever had one loyalty, And it is not to Sicily. The money grew, and with it, the violence. In 1963, a car bomb meant for a mafia rival exploded in the Palermo suburb of Ciaculli, killing 7 policemen and soldiers sent to defuse it. The outrage forced the first great wave of state reaction, mass arrests, and a parliamentary anti-mafia commission. And in these same years, Palermo's clans were moving into a business whose profits made construction look quaint. The international heroin trade, refining and shipping toward the richest drug market on earth, the United States. And here the 2 Sicilies of this story, the island and the diaspora, meet again, in the strangest way possible. In March of 1972, an American film opened in theaters. It was based on a novel by the son of Italian immigrants, and it told the story of a fictional New York crime family with roots in a Sicilian village called Corleone. The Godfather became one of the most successful and influential films ever made, and for hundreds of millions of people around the world. It permanently defined what the word mafia means: family, honor, tragedy, a code older than America. At the exact moment those images were enchanting the world, the real men from the real Corleone were consolidating power inside Cosa Nostra, and they were about to show Palermo what the organization actually was. Not opera, not honor, a machine for money and murder, preparing to kill on a scale the city had not seen since the war, and to assassinate, un by un, every servant of the Italian state who dared to stand in its way. The age of the excellent cadavers was coming, and so were 2 quiet men from Palermo, born a few blocks apart, who would finally teach the world, at the cost of everything, how to fight this thing. Chapter 12. The 2 Judges. Every story this long has a chapter it was always moving toward. This is that chapter, and it begins not with the heroes, but with the monster they had to face, because you cannot measure the men until you have measured the thing. In the late 1970s, power inside Cosa Nostra was seized by a faction from the inland town of Corleone, the real Corleone, a hard hill town whose name Hollywood had just made famous. Their leaders were Luciano Liggio, then his successors Salvatore Riina, called Totò, and Bernardo Provenzano, the Palermo bosses. The old city aristocracy of crime underestimated them as peasants. It was the last mistake many of them ever made. Between 1981 and 1983, in what became known as the Second Mafia War, the Corleonesi exterminated their rivals. The death toll in and around Palermo ran, by the counts later assembled in court, into many hundreds, with hundreds more who simply disappeared, victims of what the organization called the White Shotgun, killed and dissolved or buried where no one would ever find them. Palermo in the early 1980s experienced a level of organized killing unprecedented in its post-war history. People speak of those years as a war, and it was not a metaphor. Bodies lay in the streets in daylight, and the Corleonesi added something new, a strategy of killing not just rivals but the state itself, un by un. The servants of the Italian Republic who threatened the organization were assassinated. The police investigator who pursued the heroin networks, Boris Giuliano, shot in a cafe in 1979. The judge Cesare Terranova, the same year. The president of the Sicilian regional government, Piersanti Mattarella, a reformer, shot in his car beside his family in January of 1980, a murder whose full truth is still argued over, and whose younger brother Sergio would one day become president of Italy. the communist parliamentarian Pio La Torre, who had proposed a revolutionary law making membership in the mafia itself a crime and allowing the state to seize mafia wealth. Machine-gunned in 1982, and 4 months later, the man sent to Palermo as the government's answer. General Carlo Alberto della Chiesa, the Carabinieri commander who had broken the Red Brigade's terrorists, killed in the heart of the city with his young wife, Emanuela Setti Carraro, and their driver, 100 days after taking office. At his funeral, the crowd jeered the politicians who attended. Sicilians understood perfectly well who had left the general alone, exposed, without the powers he had begged Rome for. Italians had a phrase for these dead: cadaveri eccellenti, the excellent cadavers, the distinguished corpses. We met the first of them, the banker Nota Bartolo, 90 years earlier. Now they were falling every few months. Within weeks of Dalla Chiesa's murder, a shamed parliament finally passed La Torre's law, the Rognoni-La Torre Law of 1982. For the first time in Italian history, being a mafioso was itself a crime, and mafia fortunes could be confiscated. The dead man had armed the living. Now the two men at the center of this chapter step forward, and what strikes you first is how unlike movie heroes they were. Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino were both born in Palermo in 1939 and 1940, in the same battered old quarter of the city, near the port. They grew up a few streets apart, played on the same squares, and by some accounts even played together as boys. Both became magistrates, which in the Italian system means investigating judges, state investigators with judicial power. Falcone was methodical, ironic, a man who loved his city with the unsentimental love of someone who knew exactly what was wrong with it. Borsellino was warmer, devout, a family man adored by his students and colleagues. Neither sought fame, both understood, from the moment they took mafia cases, that they had shortened their own lives. Falcone spoke publicly about that fact with a calm that still stops the blood, saying in substance that his accounts with fate were already settled, and that what mattered was not whether a man felt fear, but whether he let it stop him. Their revolution was a revolution of method, and it sounds almost boring until you see what it did. Falcone's insight, sharpened during his investigation of a heroin case that began in 1980, was that the mafia was not local colour. It was a financial organism, and money leaves tracks. He followed bank records across oceans, built cooperation with American prosecutors, treated Cosa Nostra as a single unified structure rather than scattered gangs. After the mafia murdered the chief investigating judge Rocco Cinici with a car bomb in 1983, his successor, a quiet man from Florence, named Antonino Caponetto, institutionalized Falcone's approach by creating the anti-mafia pool, a small team of judges, Falcone, Borsellino, and colleagues who shared all mafia cases together, so that no single judge could be isolated. Isolation, they had learned from the excellent cadavers, was the mafia's real weapon. The pool was armour made of colleagues. Then, in 1984, the wall of silence cracked from the inside. Tommaso Buscetta, a Palermo mafioso of the defeated faction, arrested in Brazil, his sons and brother and son-in-law already murdered by the Corleonesi, decided to talk, and he chose to talk to Falcone. Over months of interrogations, Buscetta did something no one had ever done. He described Cosa Nostra from within, its families, its ranks, its governing commission, its rules, even its name, which investigators had barely known it used for itself. Omerta, the silence that had protected the organization for over a century, had been broken at the highest level. Other informants followed. The state, for the first time in Sicilian history, could see its enemy whole. What followed was the largest trial ever held against the mafia, anywhere. The Maxi trial opened in February of 1986 in a fortified bunker courtroom built for the purpose beside Palermo's Uccidone prison, a green concrete hall designed to withstand rocket attacks. 475 defendants, bosses in cages along the walls, some ranting, one famously sewing his own mouth shut in protest. The city outside held its breath and largely expected the usual ending. Acquittals, technicalities, forgetting. It did not come. In December of 1987, the court delivered more than 300 convictions and 19 life sentences, and in January of 1992, Italy's Supreme Court upheld the core of the verdicts, confirming, as final legal truth, Buscetta's map of a unified criminal state within the state. For Cosa Nostra, and for Toto Riina personally, that final ruling was a declaration of war, because it destroyed the organization's oldest guarantee, that in the end, in Rome, the sentences would always evaporate. The guarantee had names attached. In March of 1992, Salvo Lima, the Palermo power broker we met during the sack of Palermo, was shot dead, killed, prosecutors later concluded, precisely because he had failed to deliver the acquittals his mafia patrons expected. The organization then turned to punish the two men it blamed most. On the 23rd of May, 1992, Giovanni Falcone flew home from Rome, where he had been building a national anti-mafia prosecution office. He drove from the airport toward Palermo with his wife, Francesca Morvillo, herself a magistrate, and 3 escort agents, Vito Schifani, Rocco Di Silo, and Antonio Montinaro. Near the exit for the town of Capaci, the mafia had packed hundreds of kilograms of explosives into a drainage tunnel under the highway. A lookout on the hillside pressed the detonator as the convoy passed. The blast registered on earthquake monitors. The 3 escorts died instantly. Falcone and his wife died that evening. He was 53. 57 days later, on the 19th of July, Paolo Borsellino, who had told his wife and colleagues in those weeks that he knew he was next, that the explosive meant for him had already arrived in Palermo, and who kept working anyway, racing to carry Falcone's work forward, went to visit his mother on a Sunday afternoon in Via D'Amelio. A parked car packed with explosives was waiting. The blast killed him and 5 escort agents: Agostino Catalano, Emanuela Loi, the first woman in Italy to die in such service, Vincenzo Limuli, Walter Eddie Cosina, and Claudio Traina. To this day, aspects of the Via D'Amelio investigation remain contested, marred by a false informant and convictions later overturned, and Italian courts and journalists still fight over what was never fully explained, including a missing red diary in which Borsellino had recorded his final weeks of work. I am telling you plainly what is settled and what is not, because that is the difference between history and legend, and Borsellino deserves history. And then something happened that this 3,000-year story had never seen. Palermo rose, not against a foreign occupier, not against a tax, but against its own shadow. Furious crowds filled the streets and the funerals, jeering government ministers, weeping for the police escorts. From thousands of balconies across the city hung white bedsheets painted with words demanding justice. Ordinary families declaring, in the language of laundry, that they were done being silent. Human chains linked the sites of the murders. The magnolia tree outside Falcone's apartment became a shrine of letters and photographs that has never stopped growing. Remember the Vespers of 1282, when the city rose with knives against the French. This was the second Vespers, and its weapon was bedsheets, and I would argue it was the braver of the two, because this time the enemy lived next door, and everyone knew it. The state, shamed and enraged, finally acted like a state. Thousands of troops deployed to Sicily. The exceptionally restrictive prison regime known as 41 bis was imposed on mafia convicts, cutting them off from contact with their organizations. And in January of 1993, Totò Riina, the most wanted man in Italy, who had lived as a fugitive for 23 years, was arrested in Palermo, where he had been living the entire time. A fact that tells you everything about the decades of protection he had enjoyed. Cosa Nostra answered with terrorist bombings on the mainland in 1993, killing 10 people and damaging the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, trying to blackmail the state into retreat. The state did not retreat, and the bombing strategy died. Provenzano, who followed Riina, shows submersion. Silence. No more war. He was captured in 2006, after decades in hiding. The last great boss of that generation, Matteo Messina Denaro, was captured in January of 2023, after 30 years as a fugitive, and died in custody months later. Falcone insisted, in words Italian schoolchildren now learn, that the mafia was a human phenomenon and not an eternal condition, that like all human things, it had a beginning and an evolution, and would therefore also have an end. He did not live to see the end, but he lived long enough to prove the sentence true, and everything that has happened since has been the slow working out of his theorem. Chapter 13. The city that digested its conquerors. Fly into western Sicily today, and you will land at an airport named Falcone Borsellino. The two judges greet every arrival. Palermo put their names on the front door, which is the city's way of telling you, before you have even collected your luggage, which side it finally chose. The decades since 1992 have not been a fairy tale, and I am not going to sell you one. Cosa Nostra still exists. Prosecutors still indict its clans. Extortion has not vanished, and the organization's old talent for waiting should never be underestimated. But the balance has shifted in ways that would have seemed like fantasy to anyone standing in the smoke of Via d'Amelio. The governing commission was dismantled by waves of arrests. Hundreds of collaborators have testified, and under the law that Pio La Torre died proposing, confiscated mafia assets, farms, villas, businesses, have been turned over to cooperatives and public use, so that in shops around Sicily you can now buy pasta and wine grown on land that once belonged to bosses, with the confiscation itself printed proudly on the label. The deepest change is the one hardest to legislate, and you can date its turning points precisely. In 1991, a Palermo businessman named Libero Grassi wrote an open letter in the city's newspaper addressed to his unknown extortionist, announcing that he would not pay. He stood almost completely alone. His fellow merchants distanced themselves. The business associations shrugged. And in August of that year, he was shot dead on the sidewalk outside his home. 13 years later, in the summer of 2004, A group of young Palermitans preparing to open a pub did the arithmetic on the protection money they would be expected to pay, and instead papered the city overnight with stickers declaring that a whole people who pays the pizzo is a people without dignity. The movement became Addio Pizzo, goodbye protection money, a network that grew to hundreds of businesses publicly refusing to pay. Backed by thousands of consumers who pledge to shop where the mafia is not paid. The distance between Grassi standing alone in 1991 and Addio Pizzo standing together after 2004 is the exact distance Palermo travelled in one generation. Omerta was never genetics. It was the rational behaviour of people abandoned by their state. And when the state finally showed up, the silence began to die. The city has been reclaiming its own body, and that too can be dated. The historic centre, bombed in 1943 and left to rot through the decades of the sack, began its slow restoration in the 1990s, palace by palace, church by church, and the population that had been pushed out to the concrete suburbs began, cautiously, to return. In 2015, UNESCO crowned the Arab Norman monuments as World Heritage, and the tourists followed. In numbers the city had never seen. In 2018, Palermo served as Italy's capital of culture and hosted Manifesta, a major European art biennial, in the same palaces that had stood half-ruined within living memory. Its longtime mayor of that era, Leoluca Orlando. He had begun his political life in the 1980s as an anti-mafia reformer living under armed escort, and ended it governing a city where the anti-mafia was no longer a death sentence, but a civic identity, taught in schools, printed on shop windows, built into street names. So walk with me one last time through the Ballarò market, where this story keeps returning, because it is one of the city's oldest surviving traditions, commonly traced all the way back to the age of the emirs. The vendors are still singing out their prices in the chanting style the city associates, in popular memory at least, with its Arab past. On the tables, look at what 3,000 years left behind. Lemons and oranges descended from the agricultural revolution the Arabs began. Chickpeas, the humble food that legend says chose who lived and died at the Vespers. Swordfish from the sea the Phoenicians crossed. Couscous from Tunisia, which western Sicily never stopped cooking. Arancine, the fried rice balls whose origins Sicilians love to trace, though no document can prove it, to the kitchens of the Islamic era, and today, alongside all of it. Spices and vegetables sold by Bangladeshi and Ghanaian and Tunisian traders, whose children speak Sicilian with perfect Palermo swagger. The market does not know it is a history lesson. It is just doing what this city was founded to do, 28 centuries ago, receiving strangers, taking their goods, selling them what they need, and slowly, patiently, making them Palamitan. In January of 1072, two brothers from Normandy stood outside the gates of this city, certain they were about to change it forever. They were the latest in a long line of the certain. Carthage was certain, Rome was certain, the emirs, the viceroys, the Bourbons, the men of Corleone, all of them certain, and all of them gone. The gates are gone too, only the city remains, and the city remembers all of them, the way a river remembers rain. Every empire wanted Palermo. None of them could keep it. And now, at the end, you know the answer to the question we asked at the beginning. They could not keep it because Palermo was never a possession to be held. It was a solvent. It dissolved every conqueror into itself. took their gods and their fruit trees and their words, kept what was useful, and outlived the rest. The one enemy that nearly killed it was the one that grew from inside. And even that enemy has been learning. Slowly. In courtrooms and on market stalls and on bedsheets hung from balconies. What Carthage and Rome and Madrid all learned before it. The city wins by remaining. That is the entire history of Palermo. 28 centuries. One lesson. Still open for business on a perfect bay. Waiting, with fear, to see who sails in next.